The words hit me like a punch I never saw coming. "Where's the money?" my son asked, cold and sharp, just hours before my husband's funeral. I sat there, feeling every breath in that chilly Manhattan apartment shrink into a void I couldn't escape. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 78 years old, I thought I had seen every shade of heartbreak. But nothing prepared me for the moment when my own flesh and blood looked at me with dollar signs in their eyes, while my husband's body lay cold in the morgue just 6 blocks away. Let me take you back to where it all began. My days had become a cycle of exhaustion, masked by silence. I would wake before dawn in our cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the Lower East Side, my arthritic fingers struggling to grip the handle of my worn coffee pot. The bitter brew would fill our tiny kitchen with its familiar aroma, mixing with the lingering scent of my husband Robert's Old Spice cologne that still clung to his bathrobe hanging on the bathroom door. Through our threadbare curtains, I could see the gray light of New York City creeping across the fire escapes and brick buildings that had been my view for 43 years. The sounds of the city would start their daily symphony, distant sirens wailing like wounded animals, the rumble of garbage trucks grinding through narrow streets, and the calls of street vendors already setting up their carts on Delancey Street. But inside our apartment, there was only silence. A deafening, suffocating silence that pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The refrigerator hummed with groceries I had bought but barely touched. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, its black screen reflecting my hollow face back at me. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when that phone would ring with calls from my children, quick conversations about their days, requests for my famous apple pie recipe, or just to hear my voice. But those days had faded like old photographs left too long in the sun. Robert had been sick for 3 months. 3 long months of doctor visits, insurance forms, and medications that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. I had reached out to Kevin, our son, multiple times during those difficult weeks. I needed help. Not just financial help, though God knows we could have used it. I needed emotional support. I needed someone to sit with me in those sterile hospital waiting rooms. I needed someone to hold my hand when the doctors used words I didn't understand. But Kevin's responses were always the same. "I'm busy with work, Mom. I'll try to visit next week. Can't you handle this yourself?" Each excuse felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. When Robert passed away on that cold Tuesday morning in March, I called Kevin immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial his number. Through my tears, I managed to tell him that his father was gone. Do you know what his first response was? Not, "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom." Not, "How can I help you?" It was, "What about the arrangements? How much is this going to cost?" I should have seen it then. I should have recognized the warning signs. But grief has a way of making you cling to hope, even when that hope is as fragile as morning frost. The funeral arrangements became my burden alone. I spent hours at the funeral home on the Upper West Side, making decisions about caskets and flowers and programs, while my son sent text messages asking about costs. My daughter Linda flew in from California, but even she seemed more concerned about getting back to her job than supporting her mother through the darkest moment of her life. The night before the funeral, I sat alone in our apartment, surrounded by 43 years of memories. Photo albums lay scattered across our worn couch, pictures of family vacations to the Jersey Shore, Kevin's college graduation, Linda's wedding, grandchildren I barely saw anymore. In every photo, I was smiling, but looking at them now, I could see the tiredness in my eyes even then. I had been carrying everyone else's dreams for so long, I had forgotten what my own looked like. That's when Kevin arrived. Not to comfort me, not to share memories of his father, but to ask that question that would haunt me forever. "Where's the money, Mom?" I looked at my son, this man I had nursed through chickenpox, taught to ride a bicycle, cheered for at countless Little League games. And I saw a stranger. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't seeing his grieving mother. He was seeing an opportunity. "What money?" I asked, though my heart was already sinking. "Dad's life insurance, his pension, the savings accounts. I know there has to be money somewhere." I had spent my entire adult life sacrificing for my family, and this is what it had come to. Let me tell you about those sacrifices, because maybe then you'll understand how deeply those words cut me. When Kevin and Linda were young, Robert worked construction jobs that came and went with the seasons. During the lean months, I took on whatever work I could find. I cleaned apartments for wealthy families on the Upper East Side, scrubbing their marble floors on my hands and knees while my own children ate generic cereal for dinner. I babysat other people's children while mine walked themselves home from school because I couldn't afford to stay home with them. Every Christmas, I performed miracles with our meager budget. I would shop the clearance sales in January and hide gifts in my closet for 11 months. I sewed Halloween costumes by candlelight to save on electricity bills. When Kevin wanted a bicycle for his 10th birthday, I worked 3 extra cleaning jobs to afford it, and I'll never forget the joy on his face when he saw it on Christmas morning. But as the years passed, something changed. The gratitude faded, the appreciation disappeared. My sacrifices became expectations. When Kevin graduated from college, a college education I helped pay for by working nights at a diner in Queens, he had the nerve to complain that we hadn't paid for graduate school too. "Mom," he said to me once when he was 35 years old, "why don't you just retire already? You're holding us back." Those words still echo in my mind. Holding them back from what? From forgetting about me entirely? Robert wasn't much better. Over the years, our marriage had become a business partnership where I did all the work and he collected the benefits. He would come home from his job, plant himself in front of the television, and expect dinner to appear on the table. When I asked for help with household tasks, he would sigh heavily and mutter about how tired he was from working. But I was working too. I was working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, and then coming home to cook, clean, do laundry, and manage our finances. When I tried to talk to him about how overwhelmed I felt, he would brush me off. "Margaret, you're dramatizing everything. This is just what wives do." I began to feel like a ghost in my own life. I would sit at the kitchen table paying bills with money I had earned, in an apartment I cleaned and maintained, preparing to cook dinner with groceries I had shopped for, and I would wonder, if I disappeared tomorrow, would anyone even notice? Or would they just wonder who was going to do all the work I had been doing? The isolation was the worst part. I had lost touch with most of my friends over the years. When you're working multiple jobs and running a household, there's no time for social calls or lunch dates. The few friends I did have seemed to fade away as my life became more and more consumed by other people's needs. My own needs became invisible, even to myself. When was the last time I had bought myself something nice? When was the last time I had taken a day just for me? I honestly couldn't remember. Every dollar was spoken for before it was earned. Every free moment was filled with someone else's emergency or request. It was around this time that I started having dark thoughts. Not about hurting myself, but about whether my life had any value beyond what I could provide for others. Was I a person? Or was I just a resource to be depleted? The answer came in the form of bank statements I discovered while organizing Robert's papers after his death. For months before he passed, money had been disappearing from our savings account. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, but then larger sums. When I traced the withdrawals, I discovered they had all been made by Robert, but not for anything I knew about. I confronted him about it just days before he died. He was weak from his illness, but his voice was strong enough to lie to me. "I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret. You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining the bank statements. I wasn't imagining the missing money that I had planned to use for his medical bills and possibly my own future care. Someone had taken our security and gambled it away on stock market investments that had failed miserably. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I sat in our kitchen, holding those bank statements in my shaking hands, and for the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to feel truly angry. Not just disappointed or hurt, but furious. The ceramic teacup I was holding, a wedding gift from my mother 45 years earlier, slipped from my fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor. As I knelt to clean up the pieces, tears streaming down my face, something inside me broke too. But unlike the teacup, what broke in me was not something precious. It was the chains of obligation and guilt that had kept me trapped for decades. That night, I did something I had never done before. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and spoke out loud. "This has to stop," I said to my reflection. "This has to stop right now." I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had I become so thin? When had the light gone out of my eyes? When had I started looking like a victim instead of a survivor? For the first time in my marriage, I locked the bedroom door. I needed space to think, to feel, to plan. I spent that night going through old photo albums, but instead of feeling nostalgic, I found myself analyzing each image. In picture after picture, there I was, smiling, serving, supporting, giving. And where were the pictures of others doing the same for me? They didn't exist. I made a decision that night, sitting on my bed surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of selflessness. I would no longer be everyone's solution. I would no longer sacrifice my well-being for people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with legs. The next morning, I called Kevin and asked him to come over. I needed to talk to him about the missing money, about the future, about everything that had been building up inside me for years. His response was typical. "I'm busy, Mom. Can't it wait?" "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "It cannot wait." When he finally arrived that evening, he brought his wife Jennifer with him. I should have seen this as a red flag, bringing reinforcements to a conversation with your grieving mother. They sat on my couch like they owned the place, waiting for me to serve them coffee and cookies like always. Instead, I sat across from them with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap. "We need to talk about money," I began. Kevin perked up immediately. "Finally. I was wondering when you were going to be practical about this whole situation. Your father took money from our savings account without telling me. A lot of money. Money we needed for his medical care and my future security." Kevin's face changed. Gone was the expectant look, replaced by something harder. "What are you trying to say, Mom?" "I'm saying that the financial support you've been expecting from your father's death may not exist. I'm saying that I'm going to need to be very careful with whatever resources I have left." Jennifer spoke up for the first time. "But surely there's life insurance. There has to be something." I looked at this woman who had been married to my son for 12 years, but had never once called me just to ask how I was doing. "There is a small life insurance policy, enough to cover the funeral and maybe a few months of my expenses. That's all." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, calculating, reassessing their expectations. Finally, Kevin spoke. "Well, what about your Social Security? Your pension from the diner? You can't just spend everything on yourself." There it was, the assumption that had governed my entire life, that everything I had belonged to everyone else, that my needs came last, if they were considered at all. "Actually," I said quietly, "I can, and I'm going to." The argument that followed was unlike anything we had ever had as a family. Kevin accused me of being selfish. He reminded me of all the times they had been there for me, though when I asked for specific examples, he couldn't provide many. Jennifer suggested that maybe I should consider moving to a smaller apartment so I could help them with their mortgage payments. "We have children to think about," Kevin said, referring to my grandchildren whom I saw maybe 3 times a year. "Surely you want what's best for your grandchildren." "Of course I do," I replied. "But what's best for them is to have grandparents who model self-respect and healthy boundaries." They left that night angry and frustrated. I locked the door behind them and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Free. But the real test came the next day when my daughter Linda called from California. She had been talking to Kevin, and she had some thoughts about my new attitude. "Mom, Kevin is really worried about you. He thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. This is what they do, isn't it? When you finally stand up for yourself after years of being walked on, you must be having a breakdown. You couldn't possibly be thinking clearly." "Linda," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed something, not because there was a crisis, but just because you cared about my well-being." The silence stretched on so long I thought the call had been dropped. Finally, she spoke, her voice smaller than before. I don't know, Mom. I've been so busy with work and the kids." "I know you have, sweetheart, and I understand. But I need you to understand something too. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough. For the first time in my adult life, I'm putting my own needs on equal footing with everyone else's. That's not crazy. That's healthy. But Linda, like her brother, wasn't ready to hear this. The conversation ended with her promising to call more often, a promise I knew she wouldn't keep, and a suggestion that maybe I should talk to someone professional about my situation. Over the next few days, as I planned Robert's funeral, I felt like I was living in two different worlds. In one world, I was the grieving widow everyone expected me to be, quiet, compliant, grateful for any crumb of attention thrown my way. In the other world, I was a woman discovering her own voice after decades of silence. The funeral itself was a small affair. Robert hadn't had many close friends in his later years, and most of our relatives lived too far away to travel. Kevin and Linda were there, of course, along with a handful of Robert's former co-workers and a few neighbors from our building. Throughout the service, I kept waiting to feel the crushing grief I thought I should feel, but instead, what I felt was a strange sense of relief. Not relief that Robert was gone. I had loved him, despite everything. But relief that I no longer had to pretend I was happy with a life that had been slowly killing me. After the burial, we gathered at my apartment for what I suppose you'd call a reception. I had prepared food the night before, sandwiches, salads, cookies. It was what was expected of me, even in grief. As I watched people eat the food I had made and talk in hushed voices about Robert, I realized that even at my husband's funeral, I was working while everyone else was being taken care of. That's when Kevin pulled me aside. That's when he asked the question that started all of this. "Where's the money, Mom?" Standing there in my black dress, surrounded by the remnants of my broken life, something inside me shifted. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't there to support me in my grief. He was there to collect an inheritance. "What money?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Don't play games, Mom. Dad's life insurance, his savings, whatever he left behind. We need to talk about how we're going to handle all of this." The word "we" hit me like a slap. We, as if his father's death was a joint venture, as if my loss was his opportunity. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the street where I had lived for over 4 decades. Children were playing on the sidewalk, their laughter floating up to our third-floor window. Life was going on, oblivious to the death and devastation in apartment 3B. "There is no money, Kevin." "What do you mean there's no money? There has to be money." I turned to face him, this man who used to be my little boy, and I told him the truth. About the stock market investments, about the Bitcoin scheme Robert had fallen for in his final months, about the credit card debt I had discovered, about the life insurance policy that would barely cover the funeral expenses. Kevin's face went through several expressions: disbelief, anger, calculation. "You're lying," he said finally. "You're hiding it from us." That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were all the bank statements, all the evidence of Robert's financial disasters, all the proof of just how little we had left. I spread the papers out on the kitchen table like I was dealing cards. "Here," I said. "Look at all of it. Add it up yourself." Kevin and Jennifer huddled over the documents, their faces growing more grim with each page. Finally, Kevin looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't sadness or sympathy. It was accusation. "How could you let this happen?" he demanded. "How could you let Dad gamble away our inheritance? Our inheritance. Not my security. Not my future. Their inheritance." "I didn't know," I said simply. He hid it from me. "You should have been paying attention. You should have been watching the accounts." And there it was. Somehow, this was my fault too. The man I had trusted with my life had betrayed that trust, and I was being blamed for not being suspicious enough of my own husband. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by the debris of the reception: paper plates with half-eaten sandwiches, empty coffee cups, wadded-up napkins, the detritus of other people's comfort that I would have to clean up alone. I made a decision that night that surprised even me. I wasn't going to clean it up. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, something I never did, and sat on my couch looking at the mess. Let it be messy. Let it be imperfect. Let someone else worry about it for once. The wine made me sleepy, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. No waking up at 3 a.m. to worry about medical bills or insurance forms or whether Robert needed another pillow. Just deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling different. Not better exactly, but different. Clearer. Like I had been looking at the world through dirty glasses and someone had finally cleaned them. The first thing I did was something I had been putting off for years. I called Dr. Patricia Williams, a lawyer who had been recommended to me by Rosa Gonzalez, my neighbor from down the hall. Rosa had mentioned her during one of our brief conversations in the laundry room. Dr. Williams specialized in helping seniors protect their assets from family members who might take advantage of them. At the time, I had pushed the suggestion aside. Surely I didn't need protection from my own family. But now, sitting in my messy apartment with the memory of Kevin's cold eyes fresh in my mind, I realized that's exactly what I needed. Dr. Williams had an office in Harlem, in a brownstone building that had been converted to professional suites. When I arrived for my appointment, I was nervous. I had never hired a lawyer before. I wasn't even sure I could afford one. But Dr. Williams put me at ease immediately. She was a woman about my daughter's age, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She listened to my story without judgment, taking notes on a yellow legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Mrs. Morrison," she said when I finished, "I want you to know that you're not alone in this situation. I see cases like yours more often than I'd like to admit. Adult children who see their aging parents as financial resources rather than people deserving of care and respect. But they're my children," I said. "I love them." "Of course you do. And I'm sure they love you too, in their own way. But love and financial boundaries are not mutually exclusive. In fact, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to set clear boundaries." She explained to me how I could protect my remaining assets, how I could ensure that my Social Security and pension benefits went to my own care rather than someone else's expectations, how I could make my wishes legally clear so that no one could override them. The process took several weeks, but by the end of it, I had something I had never had before: control. Control over my own money, control over my own decisions, control over my own life. But the best part of working with Dr. Williams wasn't the legal protection. It was the validation. For the first time in years, someone was telling me that I had rights, that my needs mattered, that I deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. Meanwhile, Kevin had not given up on his quest for money that didn't exist. He called several times, each conversation becoming more heated than the last. "I talked to a lawyer," he told me during one particularly unpleasant call. "There are ways to challenge Dad's financial decisions if he wasn't mentally competent when he made them." "Your father was completely competent," I replied. "He was just greedy and foolish." "Then you should have stopped him. A wife has a responsibility to protect the family's interests." This was the theme that kept coming up. Everything was my fault. Robert's bad investments were my fault for not stopping them. The lack of inheritance was my fault for not preventing it. Even Kevin's disappointment was my fault for not managing his expectations better. I began to understand something that had taken me 78 years to learn. I had been trained by my family and by society to believe that everyone else's needs were more important than my own, that everyone else's feelings mattered more than mine, that my value as a person was determined by how much I could give to others. But that's not love. That's exploitation. Real love doesn't demand that you sacrifice your well-being for someone else's comfort. Real love doesn't measure your worth by your usefulness. Real love doesn't disappear when you can no longer provide what others want from you. The test of this new understanding came sooner than I expected. Kevin showed up at my apartment one afternoon without calling first. He looked agitated, and I could tell he had been drinking. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room. "About what?" "About your selfishness. About how you're destroying this family with your new attitude." I sat down carefully in my favorite chair, the one Robert used to complain about because it was too girly for his taste. "I'm listening. Jennifer's pregnant again. We're going to have another baby, and we need help." I felt the familiar tug of obligation, the automatic response to drop everything and figure out how to solve someone else's problem. But this time, I resisted. "Congratulations," I said. "I'm happy for you." "That's it? That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to act like a grandmother who cares about her family." "I do care about my family, but caring about someone doesn't mean sacrificing everything for them." Kevin began pacing around my small living room like a caged animal. "You used to understand family loyalty. You used to put us first. I used to put everyone first except myself. And look where it got me. It got you a family who loved you." I stood up then, slowly but with purpose. "Kevin, let me ask you something. When was the last time you asked how I was doing without wanting something from me?" He stopped pacing and stared at me. "That's not fair. When was the last time you visited just to spend time with me? Not because you needed money or help or solutions to your problems." His silence was answer enough. "When was the last time you remembered my birthday without me reminding you? When was the last time you called just to tell me you love me?" "I do love you, Mom. I know you do. But you love me for what I can do for you, not for who I am. And I can't live like that anymore." What happened next was the most painful conversation I've ever had with one of my children. Kevin accused me of being cruel and heartless. He said I was abandoning my family when they needed me most. He told me that Robert would be ashamed of the person I had become, but I held my ground. For the first time in my life, I held my ground. "I am not abandoning anyone," I said quietly. "I am simply refusing to be taken advantage of. If that makes me heartless in your eyes, then so be it." Kevin left that day angrier than I had ever seen him. As I watched him storm down the hallway toward the elevator, I felt a deep sadness. Not for myself, but for him. Somewhere along the way, I had failed to teach my children that love is not a transaction, that relationships are not banks to be emptied whenever they have a need. But I also felt something else: pride. For the first time in decades, I had stood up for myself. I had said no to unreasonable demands. I had refused to be guilted into submission. That evening, Rosa knocked on my door. She brought with her a pot of her famous black bean soup and a bottle of wine. "I heard raised voices earlier," she said gently. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Rosa was perhaps the one bright spot in my increasingly complicated life. She was a widow like me, though her husband had died several years earlier. She had raised 6 children mostly on her own while working as a seamstress in the garment district. But unlike my children, hers visited regularly, called often, and treated her with the respect and affection she deserved. "How do you do it?" I asked her that night as we shared soup and wine at my kitchen table. "How do you have such good relationships with your children?" Rosa smiled, her dark eyes twinkling. "I taught them early that love is not the same as servitude. I showed them by example that a mother is a person, not just a resource." "But didn't they resist? Didn't they want you to sacrifice everything for them?" "Of course they did. All children are naturally selfish. It's how they survive. But it's a parent's job to teach them that other people have needs and feelings too. If you never enforce boundaries, they never learn to respect them." I realized then that my problems with Kevin and Linda hadn't started when they became adults. They had started when they were children, and I first began sacrificing my own well-being for theirs. Every time I went without so they could have more, every time I put their wants ahead of my needs, every time I taught them that my comfort was less important than theirs, I was setting up this dynamic. I had created the monster that was now devouring me. But Rosa also taught me something else that night. It wasn't too late to change the pattern. It wasn't too late to demand better treatment. It wasn't too late to model self-respect for my family. "Change is hard," she said, patting my hand with her worn fingers, "especially when people have gotten used to treating you a certain way. But it's harder to live without dignity than it is to fight for it." Over the next few weeks, I began to make small changes in my life. I stopped answering the phone every time Kevin or Linda called. I let some calls go to voicemail, and I only returned the ones that seemed genuinely caring rather than demanding. I started saying no to requests that felt like demands. When Linda asked me to babysit her children during her upcoming visit to New York, not asked, really, but assumed I would do it, I told her I had other plans. "What other plans?" she demanded. "What could you possibly have going on?" "I'm taking a painting class," I said. It wasn't true when I said it, but it became true the next day when I signed up for a watercolor workshop at the community center near Central Park. That painting class became the first thing I had done for myself in decades. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I would take the subway to the Upper West Side and spend 2 hours learning to see the world through an artist's eyes. My teacher, a patient woman named Elena, taught me that art was not about creating something perfect. It was about expressing something true. My first paintings were terrible. The colors muddy, the proportions wrong, the technique clumsy, but they were mine. For the first time in years, I was creating something instead of just maintaining what others had created. I also started taking better care of my physical appearance. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I deserved to feel good about myself. I bought new clothes, not expensive ones, but ones that fit properly and made me feel confident. I got my hair styled at a salon instead of cutting it myself in the bathroom mirror. These might sound like small changes, but they felt revolutionary to me. Each decision to prioritize my own needs was a tiny act of rebellion against a lifetime of self-denial. The real test came when Kevin called to tell me that he and Jennifer were planning to visit for the weekend. In the old days, this would have meant days of preparation, deep cleaning the apartment, shopping for special foods, rearranging my schedule to accommodate their needs. Instead, I said, "That's nice. I'll be busy Saturday morning with my painting class, but you're welcome to stop by Saturday afternoon if you'd like." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "You can't skip your little art class for family?" "I don't want to skip it. It's important to me." "More important than your son?" "As important as my son. Not more, not less. Equally important." When they arrived that Saturday afternoon, they seemed genuinely surprised by the changes in both my appearance and my apartment. I had redecorated slightly, nothing dramatic, but I had moved Robert's recliner out of the living room and replaced it with a small easel where I could work on my paintings. I had taken down some of the family photos that had dominated every surface and replaced them with artwork I was creating. Jennifer looked around with barely concealed disapproval. "It looks different in here." "I'm making it more my own," I said simply. Kevin picked up one of my paintings, a watercolor of the view from my kitchen window. "When did you start doing this?" "A few weeks ago. I'm learning." He set the painting down without comment, but I could see him processing this information. His mother, who had always been available for his needs, was now doing something that had nothing to do with him. We had dinner together that evening. Take-out Chinese food instead of the elaborate home-cooked meals I used to prepare for their visits. As we ate, they filled me in on their lives, their problems, their plans. But notably absent were any questions about my life, my interests, my feelings about Robert's death. Finally, I decided to test the waters. "I've been thinking about traveling," I said. Linda, who had joined us via video call from California, looked surprised. "Traveling? Where would you go?" "There's a painting workshop in the Hudson Valley next month, a weekend retreat at a small inn near Woodstock." "You can't travel alone, Mom," Kevin said immediately. "What if something happens to you? What if something happens to me here? At least there I'd be doing something I love." They spent the next hour trying to talk me out of the idea. The trip was too expensive. It wasn't. I was too old to travel alone. I wasn't. I should save my money for emergencies. I had been saving for emergencies my entire life and had never spent a dime on myself. But their arguments felt hollow now, like echoes from an old life I was no longer living. I listened politely, but I didn't let them change my mind. After they left that night, I sat in my transformed living room feeling proud of myself. I had maintained my boundaries. I had refused to be talked out of something I wanted to do. I had treated my own needs with the same respect I had always shown others. The painting retreat was everything I had hoped it would be, and more. The inn was a converted farmhouse, surrounded by the kind of autumn foliage that makes the Hudson Valley famous. I shared meals with other artists, walked trails through the woods, and painted scenes that spoke to something deep in my soul. But the best part was the silence. Not the oppressive silence of my Manhattan apartment, but the peaceful silence of a mind at rest. For 3 days, no one needed anything from me. No one made demands on my time or energy. I was just Margaret, not someone's mother or wife or caretaker, just myself. On the last morning of the retreat, I painted a self-portrait, not a realistic one. I wasn't skilled enough for that yet. but an impressionist rendering of how I felt rather than how I looked. The woman in the painting was surrounded by light and color. She looked serene, confident, complete. When I showed the painting to Elena, she smiled. That's not the same person who started this class 6 weeks ago. She was right. The woman who had signed up for painting lessons had been hiding, afraid, apologetic about taking up space. The woman holding a paintbrush in a sunlit studio was none of those things. When I returned to New York, I found 17 voicemail messages on my phone. 16 were from Kevin, each one more agitated than the last. The 17th was from Linda, informing me that Kevin was worried sick about me because I wasn't answering my phone. I didn't return any of the calls immediately. Instead, I unpacked my suitcase, put my new paintings on the easel, and made myself a cup of tea. Then, and only then, did I call Kevin back. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I've been calling for 3 days. I was at the painting retreat I told you about." "You could have been dead. You could have had an accident. How were we supposed to know where you were?" "I left contact information for the inn on my refrigerator. If there had been a real emergency, you could have reached me." "That's not the point, Mom. The point is that you just disappeared without thinking about how it would affect us." And there it was again. My life, my choices, my happiness, all viewed through the lens of how they affected other people. The assumption that I existed primarily to serve their peace of mind, not to live my own life. "Kevin," I said, "I am a grown woman. I don't need permission to take a weekend trip, but you need to be considerate of people who care about you. People who care about me should be happy that I'm doing something I enjoy, not angry that I didn't check in often enough." The conversation went downhill from there. Kevin accused me of becoming selfish and inconsiderate. He said I was turning into someone he didn't recognize. He implied that my new independence was somehow disrespectful to Robert's memory. But his words didn't have the power to hurt me the way they once had. I had spent a weekend surrounded by people who celebrated creativity and growth and joy. His anger seemed small and petty in comparison. After I hung up the phone, I realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in my adult life, I cared more about my own opinion of myself than about other people's opinions of me. This realization was tested again, a few weeks later, when I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a lawyer representing Robert's estate. Apparently there had been some holdings that neither Robert nor I had known about. "Mrs. Morrison," the lawyer said, "I'm calling about a trust fund that your late husband was named as a beneficiary of. It seems his Uncle Harold left a substantial sum that has been earning interest for several years. Your husband never claimed it, but as his widow, you are now entitled to the full amount." I nearly dropped the phone. "How much money are we talking about?" "After taxes and fees, approximately $250,000. I sat down heavily on my couch, my mind reeling. $250,000. More money than I had ever imagined having. Enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without depending on anyone. But even more shocking was what came next. After I hung up with the lawyer, I found myself thinking not about what I could do with the money, but about whether I should tell my children about it. The old Margaret would have called Kevin immediately, would have seen this windfall as an opportunity to buy back their love and attention, would have started making plans to distribute the inheritance they had been expecting. But the new Margaret felt something else entirely. I felt protective of this money. It represented security, independence, freedom from the very dynamics that had been poisoning my relationships with my children. I decided not to tell them right away. I needed time to think, to plan, to make sure I handled this revelation in a way that supported my newfound boundaries rather than undermining them. A few days later, Kevin called to inform me that he and Jennifer had decided on names for their new baby. They were planning a gender reveal party and expected me to help with the costs. "We're thinking about renting a hall," Jennifer said when she got on the phone. "Nothing too fancy, but nice enough for family photos. We figured you could contribute maybe $2,000. $2,000 that, a month ago, I didn't have. $2,000 that I now had 40 times over. But I found myself saying, "I'm sorry, but that's not in my budget right now." The silence was so long I thought they had hung up. Finally, Kevin spoke, his voice cold. "Not in your budget? Mom, this is your grandchild we're talking about. I understand that, and I'm very excited about the baby, but I can't afford to contribute to a party right now. What followed was a familiar litany of guilt, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. They reminded me of all the money they claimed I used to spend on family celebrations. They suggested that I was being deliberately hurtful. They questioned whether I really cared about my grandchildren at all. But this time, their tactics felt transparent. I could see exactly what they were doing, and it had no power over me. I love my grandchildren very much, I said calmly, but I'm not going to prove that love by going into debt to pay for a party. After I hung up, I realized I had just passed another test. I had money, more money than they could ever have guessed, and I had still said no to their demands. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I chose not to enable their entitled behavior. This felt like progress, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. A week later, there was a knock on my door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Kevin standing in the hallway with two people I didn't recognize, a middle-aged man and woman in business attire. When I opened the door, Kevin smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hi, Mom. These are friends of mine, Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Wells from Adult Protective Services. They wanted to meet you." My blood turned to ice. I knew exactly what was happening. Kevin had reported me as a potentially incompetent elderly person, hoping to have my financial affairs placed under some kind of supervision that he would undoubtedly volunteer to provide. I invited them in because I had no choice, but I was terrified. What if they believed whatever lies Kevin had told them? What if they decided I was indeed incompetent? What if this was the end of my newfound independence? Dr. Patterson was kind but professional. He asked me questions about my daily routine, my decision-making process, my understanding of my financial situation. Mrs. Wells took notes and observed my living space, presumably looking for signs of neglect or confusion. Throughout the interview, Kevin hovered nearby, occasionally interjecting comments about how worried he was about my recent changes in behavior. He mentioned my new independence as if it were a symptom of decline rather than growth. He painted my painting classes and weekend retreat as evidence of poor judgment rather than healthy self-care. But I had learned something important over the past few months. I had learned to trust my own voice. When Dr. Patterson asked me directly about my mental state, I looked him in the eye and spoke clearly. "Doctor, I understand that my son is concerned about me, but I want you to know that I have never felt more mentally clear or emotionally healthy than I do right now. For the first time in my adult life, I am making decisions based on what I believe is best for me, rather than what other people expect of me. If that seems like a decline to my family, it's only because they benefited from my previous inability to set boundaries." I saw Mrs. Wells look up from her notepad with something that might have been surprise, or perhaps respect. The interview lasted about an hour. When it was over, Dr. Patterson shook my hand and said, "Mrs. Morrison, based on my assessment, you appear to be cognitively intact and fully capable of making your own decisions. I see no reason for any intervention at this time." Kevin's face went white. "But don't you think she's acting strangely? Don't you think someone should be monitoring her finances?" "What I think," Dr. Patterson said mildly, "is that your mother is an adult with the right to live her life as she chooses, as long as she's not harming herself or others." After they left, Kevin and I had the most honest conversation we had ever had. He was furious that his plan had backfired, and for the first time, he dropped all pretense of concern for my welfare. "This isn't about what's best for you, Mom. This is about what's best for the family. You're being selfish." "Kevin," I said, looking at this man who had once been my little boy, "do you love me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Of course I love you. You're my mother. Do you love me as a person? Do you care about my happiness, my dreams, my well-being? Or do you love me as a provider, as someone who exists to meet your needs and solve your problems?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the question. Finally, he said, "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me the truth." More silence. Then, "I want you to be my mother, the way you used to be." "The way I used to be was miserable, Kevin. I was lonely and exhausted and taken for granted. I felt like a ghost in my own life. But you were there for us. You were reliable. You were useful. Useful. There it was. the word that summed up our entire relationship. I wasn't his mother. I was his resource. I wasn't a person with my own needs and dreams. I was a tool for meeting his needs and fulfilling his dreams. I need you to leave now, I said quietly. Mom, I didn't mean… Yes, you did. And I need you to leave. After Kevin left that day, I sat in my apartment feeling the full weight of what had just happened. My son had tried to have me declared incompetent rather than accept that I had the right to make my own decisions. He had been willing to take away my autonomy rather than respect my boundaries. But I had survived it. More than that, I had prevailed. I had proven to myself and to others that I was capable, competent, and deserving of respect. That night, I called Dr. Williams and told her what had happened. She wasn't surprised. It's actually quite common, she said. When elderly people begin to assert themselves financially, family members sometimes try to use the system to regain control. But the fact that you handled the situation so well shows that you're on the right track. I also called Rosa and told her about the day's events. She listened with the kind of attention that had become so precious to me, the attention of someone who cared about my experience for its own sake, not because of what I could do for them. You should be proud of yourself, she said. You stood your ground against a very serious threat to your autonomy. Pride. It was an emotion I was still getting used to feeling about myself, but Rosa was right. I should be proud. I had faced down my worst fear, losing control of my own life, and I had come through it stronger than before. Over the next few weeks, I began to truly embrace my new reality. I enrolled in more classes, not just painting now, but also poetry writing and basic computer skills. I wanted to reconnect with the world beyond my small apartment, to explore interests I had abandoned decades earlier. I also began to form new friendships. Elena, my painting teacher, invited me to join a group of artists who met monthly to share their work and discuss technique. Rosa introduced me to other women in our building, and I discovered a whole community of people I had been too busy to notice. For the first time in years, I had a social life that wasn't centered around family obligations or crises. I had relationships based on mutual interest and respect, rather than guilt and duty. But the most significant change was in how I viewed myself. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now walked with her shoulders back. The woman who had once whispered her opinions now spoke with confidence. The woman who had once seen herself as valuable only for what she could provide now understood that she had worth simply for who she was. This transformation didn't go unnoticed by my family. Linda called one afternoon, ostensibly to check on me, but really to express her confusion about the reports she had been getting from Kevin. He says you're acting like a completely different person, she said. Maybe I am. But Mom, we're worried about you. This isn't like you at all. You're right, I said. This isn't like the person you knew, but maybe the person you knew wasn't really me. Maybe she was just who I thought I needed to be to keep everyone happy. Don't you want us to be happy? It was such a loaded question. Of course I wanted my children to be happy, but I had finally learned the difference between wanting someone to be happy and sacrificing my own well-being to manufacture their happiness. I want you to be happy, sweetheart, but I also want to be happy. And I've discovered that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Linda, like Kevin, was struggling to accept that her mother had needs and desires beyond serving her family. She couldn't understand why I wouldn't just go back to being the person I had always been. But I couldn't go back. Even if I had wanted to, which I didn't, it was impossible. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unfeel what you've felt. You can't return to sleep once you've truly awakened. The final test of my transformation came several months later, during the holiday season. Thanksgiving had always been my responsibility. Cooking for hours, cleaning for days, managing everyone's dietary restrictions and preferences, all so the family could gather for a few hours of complaint and criticism disguised as tradition. This year, when Kevin called to discuss the menu, I said something that shocked us both. I won't be hosting Thanksgiving this year. The silence that followed was so complete I thought my phone had died. What do you mean you won't be hosting? He finally asked. I mean, I'm not going to spend 3 days cooking and cleaning so that people can come to my home and treat me like hired help. But you always host Thanksgiving. It's tradition. It was tradition. This year I'm starting a new tradition. What new tradition? This year I'm going to Rosa's family gathering. They invited me and I said yes. What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Kevin tried every tactic in his considerable arsenal. He told me I was destroying the family. He accused me of loving strangers more than my own children. He suggested that Robert would be ashamed of my selfishness. But none of it worked. I had developed what I now recognized as emotional immunity. Their manipulation tactics were like a virus I had already recovered from. I could recognize the symptoms, but they no longer had the power to make me sick. Thanksgiving with Rosa's family was a revelation. I had forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed into a gathering without conditions or expectations. Rosa's children and grandchildren treated me with genuine warmth. They asked about my painting, my classes, my interests. They included me in conversations without making me feel like I was intruding. But most importantly, they let me contribute without taking advantage of me. When I offered to bring dessert, they accepted graciously but didn't pile on additional requests. When I helped with the dishes, they worked alongside me rather than disappearing while I cleaned up alone. As I sat at Rosa's table, surrounded by laughter and genuine affection, I realized what I had been missing all those years. This was what family was supposed to feel like. This was what love looked like when it wasn't conditional on service or sacrifice. That night, as I walked back to my own apartment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not the bitter gratitude of someone who accepts crumbs because it's better than nothing, but the sincere gratitude of someone who has discovered that she deserves a place at the feast. Christmas came and went without the usual drama. I sent thoughtful gifts to my children and grandchildren, but I didn't empty my bank account to prove my love. I attended a lovely Christmas Eve service with Rosa and her family, and I spent Christmas Day reading a book I had been wanting to read for months. It was the most peaceful Christmas I had had in decades. But my journey wasn't over yet. In February, something happened that tested every boundary I had worked so hard to establish. Kevin called to tell me that he and Jennifer were getting divorced. He was moving out of their house and needed a place to stay temporarily while he figured out his next steps. The old me would have immediately offered my spare bedroom, my support, my life savings if necessary. The new me said, "I'm sorry to hear about the divorce. That must be very difficult for everyone involved. So, can I crash on your couch for a few weeks?" No. The single word hung in the air like a challenge. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, you cannot stay here. But Mom, I'm your son. I need help. You are my son, and I love you. But you are also a 45-year-old man who needs to solve his own housing problems. What followed was the most vicious argument we had ever had. Kevin accused me of being heartless, selfish, vindictive. He said I was punishing him for past mistakes. He threatened to never let me see my grandchildren again. That last threat was the one designed to bring me to my knees. And it did hurt, deeply. But I had learned something over the past year about the difference between pain and damage. Pain is inevitable when you love someone who is determined to hurt you. But damage only occurs when you allow that pain to change your behavior in ways that harm your own well-being. "Kevin," I said when he finally stopped shouting, "I want you to think carefully about what you just said. You're threatening to use my grandchildren as weapons against me because I won't let you move into my apartment. Do you really think that's the kind of person you want to be?" The question seemed to take some of the wind out of his sails. For a moment, he sounded less like an angry man and more like a confused boy. "I don't know what else to do, Mom. I don't have anywhere else to go." "That's not true, and you know it. You have friends. You can afford to rent a room or a small apartment. You have options. You just don't like any of them. But family is supposed to help family. Family is supposed to love and support each other, but support doesn't mean enabling bad behavior or sacrificing your own well-being for someone else's convenience." He hung up on me that day, and I didn't hear from him for weeks. During that silence, I sometimes wondered if I had made the right choice. But then I would remember the misery of my previous life, the constant anxiety, the feeling of being used and unappreciated, and I knew I had chosen correctly. Kevin eventually found an apartment and a new job. He didn't ask for my help with either, which I took as progress. When he finally called again, it was to tell me he had started seeing a therapist. She says I have some issues with boundaries and entitlement, he said, as if this was news to anyone. What do you think about that? There was a long pause. I think maybe she's right. I think maybe I've been treating you unfairly for a long time. It wasn't a full apology, but it was acknowledgement. For now, that was enough. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of renewal that went beyond the changing seasons. I had been living my new life for almost a year, and I was beginning to see the fruits of my transformation. My painting had improved dramatically. What started as a way to fill time had become a genuine passion. I was planning to enter some of my work in a local art show, something the old me never would have had the courage to do. My friendships had deepened. Rosa had become like a sister to me, and through her I had connected with a whole community of women who understood the challenges of aging with dignity in a world that often dismisses older people. My relationship with Linda had improved somewhat. She was still struggling to accept the new me, but she was making an effort to treat me with more respect. Our conversations were becoming less about what I could do for her, and more about who we were as people. And my relationship with myself had transformed completely. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I no longer felt guilty for having needs and desires. I no longer measured my worth by my usefulness to others. But the most significant change came in May, when I finally decided to tell my children about the inheritance I had received. I invited both Kevin and Linda to lunch at a restaurant in Midtown, neutral territory where we could have a serious conversation without the baggage of family history weighing down every word. As we sat in the bright, bustling restaurant, surrounded by the energy of people living their own lives, I told them about Uncle Harold's trust fund and the $250,000 that had been quietly waiting for me. Their reactions were exactly what I had expected. Shock, followed quickly by calculation, followed by barely controlled anger that I had kept this information from them. "How long have you known?" Kevin demanded. "Since last fall. And you didn't think we deserved to know about it?" "I didn't think it was any of your business." Linda leaned forward, her voice carefully controlled. "Mom, we're your children. Of course it's our business." "Why?" I asked simply. "It's my money. I inherited it. How is it your business?" They looked at each other as if I had spoken in a foreign language. The idea that their mother might have financial resources that weren't automatically available to them was apparently incomprehensible. "Because we're family," Kevin said finally. "Because you're supposed to share with family." "I do share with family," I replied. "I share my time, my attention, my love, my advice, my support. But I don't owe you my money just because we share DNA." What followed was a long, difficult conversation about expectations, entitlement, and the difference between helping someone and enabling them. I explained that I was planning to use the money to secure my own future, to ensure that I could afford good health care, comfortable housing, and the independence I had worked so hard to achieve. "But what about our inheritance?" Jennifer asked. Yes, she had come to lunch uninvited, apparently assuming she had the right to participate in discussions about my finances. "What about it?" "Well, this money would have been part of Dad's estate if he had claimed it. So technically, it should be part of our inheritance." I looked at this woman who had been married to my son for over a decade, but had never shown the slightest interest in my well-being, and I felt a clarity that was almost blinding. "Jennifer," I said calmly, "let me explain something to you. This money was left to Robert by his uncle. Robert never claimed it, so it passed to me as his widow. It is now my money, legally and morally. If there is anything left when I die, and that's a big if, considering the cost of aging in America, then you can discuss inheritance. But until then, my finances are not your concern." The lunch ended badly, with Kevin and Linda storming out, and Jennifer making some unpleasant comments about my selfishness. I sat alone at the table for a few more minutes, finishing my coffee and processing what had just happened. I felt sad, but I also felt proud. I had stood my ground against a coordinated assault on my boundaries. I had refused to be bullied into giving up my financial security for the sake of other people's expectations. That night, I called Dr. Williams and told her about the lunch. She listened without judgment, as always, and then said something that brought tears to my eyes. "Margaret, you have become the client I most hoped you would become. You have learned not just to protect your assets, but to protect your autonomy. That's the most valuable thing any of us can own. Summer arrived with a heat wave that drove most of my neighbors indoors, but I found myself spending more time outside than I had in years. I took long walks through Central Park, visited museums, attended outdoor concerts. I was reclaiming the city that had been my home for so long, but that I had barely experienced while I was busy serving everyone else's needs. I also started dating, not seriously, and not with any intention of remarrying, but I began accepting invitations from gentlemen I met in my various classes and activities. It felt strange at first, almost rebellious, to spend time with someone simply because I enjoyed their company, not because they needed something from me. One evening in July, I was having dinner with a lovely man named Frank, who I had met in my poetry writing class. He was telling me about his late wife, and I found myself sharing stories about Robert that I had never told anyone before. "It sounds like you were lonely even when you were married," Frank observed gently. "I was," I admitted. "I was surrounded by people who needed me, but I felt completely alone. And now?" I looked around the restaurant, at the couples and families and friends sharing meals and conversation, and then I looked back at Frank's kind, interested face. "Now I'm alone sometimes, but I'm not lonely. I know the difference now." That might have been the moment when I truly understood how much my life had changed. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. As summer turned to fall, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to sell my apartment and move to a smaller, brighter place in a neighborhood I had always loved but never thought I could afford. The sale would give me additional financial security, and the move would symbolize my complete break from the life I had been living before. When I told Rosa about my plans, she was sad but supportive. "You need to live your own life now," she said. "I'll miss you, but I'm proud of you for choosing yourself." When I told my children, their reactions were predictably negative. How could I sell the apartment where they had grown up? What about family memories? What about their inheritance? But I had heard all these arguments before, and they no longer had power over me. I was making this decision for me, and that was reason enough. The new apartment was a one-bedroom in the village, with tall windows and hardwood floors and a small balcony where I could set up my easel. It was half the size of my old place, but twice as bright, and from the moment I walked in, it felt like home. Moving day was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. As I packed up 43 years of accumulated stuff, I found myself making ruthless decisions about what deserved space in my new life. Old furniture that Robert had chosen but I had never liked, donated to charity. Clothes that I had worn because they were practical rather than because I enjoyed them, given away. Books I had kept but never read. Dishes I had never used. Decorations that reflected someone else's taste. All of it went. What remained were the things that brought me joy. My art supplies, my favorite books, photos that made me smile, a few pieces of furniture that were both beautiful and comfortable. My new apartment was spare but elegant, simple but sophisticated. It looked like the home of someone who knew herself and liked what she knew. On my first night in the new place, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on my balcony watching the sun set over the city. The sounds of the village were different from the Lower East Side. More music, more laughter, less anger. I could hear someone playing guitar in a nearby apartment, and the sound mixed beautifully with the evening breeze. As I sat there, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had started with the worst day of my life, the day Kevin asked about the money before his father's funeral, but it had led me to some of the best days I had ever experienced. I thought about the woman I had been a year and a half ago, frightened, depleted, invisible even to herself. Then I thought about the woman I was now, confident, creative, independent, surrounded by genuine friendship and respect. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when I had been tempted to go back to the familiar patterns of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing, but each time I had chosen myself instead of choosing the path of least resistance. I had grown stronger. Winter arrived early that year, but I barely noticed. My new apartment was warm and bright, and I had filled my calendar with activities I enjoyed: painting classes, poetry readings, museum visits, dinners with friends. I was busier than I had ever been, but it was a different kind of busy, chosen rather than imposed, energizing rather than draining. Christmas came and went quietly. I sent gifts to my grandchildren and cards to my children, but I didn't exhaust myself trying to recreate some idealized version of family togetherness. Instead, I spent Christmas Eve at a candlelight service at a beautiful church in the village, and Christmas Day with Frank and some other friends who had become like chosen family to me. It was perfect in its simplicity. In January, I received a phone call that brought my transformation full circle. It was Kevin, and for the first time in years, he wasn't calling because he needed something. He was calling because he wanted to apologize. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been thinking a lot about the past few years, and I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you a lot of apologies." I listened as he acknowledged the ways he had taken advantage of my generosity. He talked about the therapy he had been doing, the painful realizations he had come to about his sense of entitlement, and his treatment of people he claimed to love. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he said. "But I want you to know that I see now how badly I treated you, and I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." It was the conversation I had been hoping for but never expected to have. When I hung up the phone, I cried. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. My son was still capable of growth, still capable of becoming the man I had always hoped he could be. Linda called a few days later with a similar message. Her apology was less detailed than Kevin's, but it was sincere. She also mentioned that she had been talking to a therapist about family dynamics and had come to some uncomfortable realizations about her own behavior. "I want to have a different kind of relationship with you, Mom," she said. "One where I actually care about your happiness, not just what you can do for me." These conversations didn't erase the years of pain and exploitation, but they opened the door to healing. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt hopeful about my relationships with my children. But even if they hadn't called, even if they had never acknowledged their mistakes or apologized for their behavior, I would have been okay. Because the most important relationship I had rebuilt was the one with myself. Spring arrived with an explosion of cherry blossoms in Washington Square Park, and I found myself thinking about new beginnings. I had been living my new life for almost 2 years now, and I was ready for the next chapter. I decided to plan a trip to Europe, something I had always dreamed of but never thought possible. Not a package tour or a rushed vacation, but a month-long journey through Italy and France, staying in small hotels and painting the landscapes that had inspired artists for centuries. When I told Frank about my plans, he looked wistful. "I've always wanted to see Tuscany," he said. "Come with me," I said impulsively. His face lit up with surprise and delight. "Really? You wouldn't mind the company?" "I'd love the company." As we began planning our trip together, I realized that this was what healthy relationships looked like. Two independent people choosing to share experiences because they enjoyed each other's company, not because one needed something from the other. The night before we left for Europe, I stood on my balcony looking out over the city that had been my home for so long. Tomorrow, I would begin the adventure of a lifetime, traveling with a man who made me laugh and treated me with respect and affection. I thought about the woman who had sat in a dreary apartment just 2 years earlier, feeling invisible and unworthy of love or attention. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I was now living, the independence, the creativity, the joy, the sense of possibility that filled every day. I raised my glass of wine to the twinkling lights of the city and whispered a toast to the woman I had become. "Here's to choosing yourself," I said. "Here's to never being small again." The next morning, Frank and I boarded a plane to Rome, and I began what might be the most exciting chapter of my life yet. As the plane lifted off from JFK Airport, and I watched New York shrink below me, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, that dignity is not selfish, that setting boundaries is not cruel, that loving yourself is not narcissistic. I had learned that real love doesn't diminish when you stop enabling bad behavior. In fact, it often grows stronger when it's based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Most importantly, I had learned that I was worth fighting for, worth standing up for, worth choosing again and again every single day. 6 months later, I'm back in my apartment in the village, surrounded by paintings I created during our European adventure and plans for future travels. My relationship with Frank has blossomed into something beautiful and healthy. My friendships have deepened and multiplied. My art has evolved to the point where I'm preparing for my first solo show. And my relationships with Kevin and Linda, while still a work in progress, have improved dramatically. They visit now not because they need something, but because they want to spend time with me. They ask about my life, my interests, my dreams. They treat me like a person rather than a resource. But the most important change is internal. I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead. I make decisions based on what I want rather than what others expect. I speak up for myself without apologizing. I take up space unapologetically. I am no longer the woman who asked for permission to exist. I am the woman who grants herself permission to thrive. The inheritance money that started this whole transformation is still mostly intact, earning interest in accounts that are protected and planned for my future. But the real inheritance, the gift Uncle Harold unknowingly gave me, wasn't money. It was the opportunity to discover my own worth, my own voice, my own power. Sometimes people ask me if I have any regrets about the way I handled the situation with my family. They wonder if I should have been more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. But I don't have regrets. I have relief. Relief that I finally learned to treat myself with the same compassion I had always shown others. Relief that I discovered it's never too late to start living authentically. Relief that I chose dignity over dysfunction, self-respect over self-sacrifice. My story isn't unusual. There are women and men all over the world who have spent decades being taken for granted, exploited, and emotionally manipulated by the very people who claim to love them. There are elderly people in particular who are seen as resources to be mined rather than human beings deserving of respect and care. But here's what I want you to know. It doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to accept mistreatment because it comes from family. You don't have to sacrifice your well-being to prove your love. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You have the right to be treated with respect. You have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to choose yourself, even when, especially when, other people don't like that choice. It's not selfish to want dignity. It's not cruel to demand respect. It's not heartless to refuse to be exploited. It's human. As I sit here now, typing these words on my laptop while the afternoon sun streams through the windows of my beautiful apartment, I want to end with a question and an invitation. Have you ever lived something like this? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, valuable only for what you could provide rather than who you were? Have you ever wondered if love and exploitation were the same thing? If any of this feels familiar, I want you to know that you're not alone. More importantly, I want you to know that change is possible, no matter how entrenched the patterns seem, no matter how guilty you feel about putting yourself first, no matter how much resistance you face from people who benefit from your self-sacrifice. Please share your story in the comments below. Tell us about your journey toward self-respect, or your struggles to begin that journey. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to take their first step toward freedom. And if you found strength in my story, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps me reach someone else who might need to hear that they matter, that they're worth fighting for, that it's never too late to choose themselves. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for witnessing my transformation. Thank you for being part of my journey toward becoming the woman I was always meant to be, the woman who knows her worth, the woman who chooses herself, the woman who will never be small again.